Now look at your own pit. You have one. Maybe more than one. Maybe it is a family wound that goes back years. Maybe it is a betrayal by someone you trusted with everything you had. Maybe it is a season of being forgotten, of doing the right thing quietly and faithfully while no one notices and the years pass and the phone never rings. You are not in that pit because God has forgotten you. You are not in that prison because God has lost interest in your story. The same Lord who was with Joseph in the pit is with you in yours. The text does not change. The promise does not change. The Lord is with you. And the day will come, maybe not in one day like Joseph, maybe slower, maybe in ways smaller and quieter than a throne in Egypt, when you will look back at the worst chapter of your life and see what was being built in it: the character, the trust, the capacity to forgive, the understanding of grace that no comfortable life could have ever given you. The brothers who sold you may never apologize. Joseph's never really did, not in the way we wish they had, but forgiveness is not for them. Forgiveness is the moment you, like Joseph, can finally look at the worst thing that ever happened to you and say, God meant it for good, and mean it. And feel the chains fall off your wrists for the first time in years. And if this teaching has blessed you, give it a like so other brothers and sisters can find it too. There is one more thing about Joseph you may have missed. When his father Jacob blessed him at the end of his life, he called Joseph a fruitful bough by a spring whose branches run over a wall. And it was the wall, the obstacle, the very thing that should have stopped him, that the branches grew over. That is what God does with your pain. He grows the branches over the wall. He turns the place that should have ended you into the place from which you bear fruit for others. So look at your hands today. Look at what God has placed in them: the waiting, the wounds, the unanswered prayer, the years that feel forgotten. None of it is wasted. None of it is hidden from Him. He sees every dream interpreted that no one remembered. He sees every faithful day in the prison no one is watching. He is preserving life through you in ways you will not understand until you stand on the other side and look back. The dust still clings to his sandals, but now the sandals are on the feet of a ruler, and the brothers who tore the coat are bowing, not because they have to, but because they have been forgiven. And the coat that was torn so long ago has become a robe of authority that no one will ever take from him again. That is your story too, held by the same God, written by the same hand, headed for the same kind of ending, the kind only He can write. Think about what God was doing the whole time. The pit was not a delay. The slavery was not a delay. The false accusation was not a delay. The forgotten years were not a delay. Every single piece of suffering had a purpose Joseph could not see. He had to be sold so he could be in Egypt. He had to be in Potiphar's house to learn how to manage a household. He had to be in prison to meet the cupbearer. He had to be forgotten for 2 more years so that he would still be in prison the exact morning Pharaoh's dreams came. Subscribe to keep discovering together the stories God left written for us. Because what is coming next is the most beautiful part, the part where Joseph finally understands. The 7 years of plenty came. Joseph stored grain in every city of Egypt until the records could no longer measure it. The 7 years of famine came, and the famine was not only in Egypt, it was in Canaan too. Joseph's father, Jacob, now old and bent, heard there was grain in Egypt and sent his sons, the same sons who had sold their brother, to go and buy food. They arrived in Egypt. They were brought before the governor of all the land, the second most powerful man in the empire. And they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground, just like the dream had said. 22 years earlier, the sheaves bowing down. Joseph recognized them immediately. They did not recognize him. He was a grown man now in Egyptian dress, speaking through an interpreter. He looked at them, these men who had thrown him in a pit, who had sold him for 20 pieces of silver, who had told his father he was dead, and he wept. But he wept where they could not see him. Then he tested them. He accused them of being spies. He kept Simeon hostage. He demanded they bring back their youngest brother, Benjamin, Rachel's other son, Joseph's only full brother. He filled their sacks with grain and secretly put their money back inside, terrifying them when they discovered it on the road home. Why the tests? Why not just reveal himself right then and there? Because Joseph needed to know. He needed to know if they had changed. He needed to know if the same men who had sold one son of Rachel would also sacrifice the other one. He needed to know if forgiveness was even possible, not just for them, but for him. They came back. They brought Benjamin. Joseph wept again in private when he saw him. He prepared a feast. He sent them home with grain and secretly placed his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, then sent his steward to chase them down and accuse them of theft. And here, finally, the change comes. Judah, the same Judah who had suggested selling Joseph in the first place, steps forward. He offers himself in Benjamin's place. He says, "Take me as your slave. Do not take the boy. Our father will die if he loses him." Joseph could not contain himself any longer. He sent every Egyptian out of the room, and then, alone with his brothers, with tears streaming down his face, he said the words that have echoed for 4,000 years. Genesis 45, verse 4. "I am Joseph your brother, who you sold into Egypt." They were terrified. Of course they were. The man they had betrayed now had the power to crush them with a single word. And what he said next is one of the most important sentences in the entire Bible. "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life, not, I forgive you. Not, you should be grateful I am being merciful." He says, God sent me. He reframes the entire story. The betrayal was not the story. The pit was not the story. The prison was not the story. The story was God preserving life, their lives, the lives of their families, the lives of generations yet unborn, through a brother they had thrown away. And years later, after their father Jacob had died and the brothers were afraid Joseph would finally take his revenge, Joseph said it again, and this time he said it forever. Genesis 50, verse 20. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, as they are this day." Stop and let that sentence rest in you. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Both things are true. The brothers really did intend evil. Joseph does not pretend otherwise. He does not minimize what they did. He names it. They meant evil, and God meant good, through the very same act, at the very same moment. That is not coincidence theology. That is not a sentimental verse for a coffee mug. That is the deepest truth in the Bible about how God works in the suffering of his children. God does not need evil to do good. But when evil happens, and it will happen, in your life and in mine, God is not absent. God is not surprised. God is already weaving it, quietly and patiently, into something that will preserve life. maybe yours, maybe someone else's, maybe someone you have not noticed him yet. Genesis 39 says Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. She wanted him. She told him so. He refused, and then she told him again, day after day, and he refused again, and then one day she grabbed his garment, and he ran, leaving the cloth in her hand, and she lied. She accused him of the very thing he had refused to do, and Potiphar believed her. So Joseph went from the pit to the palace to the prison. Genesis 39 verse 20. He was thrown into the king's prison, the place where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. And the text repeats itself almost stubbornly. The Lord was with Joseph in the prison. If this story has already spoken to your heart, leave it in the comments. I want to know what the Lord has shown you today, because we are not even halfway through. Joseph spent years in that prison. We do not know exactly how many, but we know that when he eventually stood before Pharaoh, he was 30 years old. He had been 17 when his brother sold him. Do the math. 13 years. 13 years from the pit to the throne. 13 years of waiting on a promise that, by every visible measure, had been broken. And here is what most people miss. In the middle of that waiting, Joseph kept showing up. He kept being faithful. The chief jailer noticed him the same way Potiphar had noticed him, and put him in charge of the other prisoners. Joseph rose again. Even in chains, Joseph rose. One day, 2 new prisoners arrived. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker. Both had offended the king somehow. Both, on the same night, had strange dreams. And in the morning, their faces were troubled. Joseph saw them. And here is the detail I want you to notice. He saw them. He noticed that something was wrong. A man in his own prison sentence, a man with every reason to be turned inward and bitter, looked at 2 strangers and asked, "Why are your faces so sad today?" That is a man who has not let his pit make him cold. That is a man who has decided that even here, even now, he will be present. He will love. They told him their dreams. Joseph interpreted them. The cupbearer would be restored in 3 days. The baker would be hanged in 3 days. And both came to pass exactly as he had said. Joseph asked only one thing of the cupbearer. "Remember me when it is well with you. Mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this place." The cupbearer was restored. And then Genesis 40 verse 23 gives us one of the most painful sentences in the whole Bible. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. 2 more years. 2 more years in that prison. 2 more years of being forgotten by the one person who could help him. Have you been there? Have you ever done the right thing? Done it quietly? Done it faithfully, and then watched the person who promised to remember you forget you completely? Have you ever wondered if your faithfulness even matters when no one seems to notice? God noticed. God always notices. But God was working on a timeline that Joseph could not see, a clock set by heaven and not by human urgency. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. 7 fat cows came out of the Nile, and then 7 lean cows came up and ate them. He dreamed it twice. He woke troubled. He called for every magician and wise man in Egypt, and none of them could interpret it. And then, and only then, the cupbearer remembered. "There is a man," he said, "in the prison, a young Hebrew. He interprets dreams." Joseph was rushed out, shaved, given new clothes, brought before Pharaoh. And the first thing he says, the very first thing, is not about himself. It is about God. Genesis 41 verse 16. "It is not in me." God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Read that again. The man has been in a pit, a slave market, a prison, and forgotten for years. He has finally been brought before the most powerful man on earth, with the chance to plead his case, to negotiate his freedom, to speak for himself. And the first words out of his mouth are, "It is not in me." God will give the answer. That is a man who has been broken in all the right ways. That is a man whose pit did its work. Joseph interpreted the dream. 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of famine. He told Pharaoh to find a wise and discerning man and put him in charge of storing grain during the years of plenty so that Egypt would survive the famine. And Pharaoh, looking at this Hebrew slave who had just spoken to him with the calm authority of someone who knows exactly where his help comes from, said, "Can we find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God? You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall be ruled. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. In one day, from prison to second in Egypt, in one day, 13 years of waiting, and one day to his sandals. His brothers stand around him in a circle, and not one of them is smiling. The coat, the one his father made for him, the one with the long sleeves and the colors no other son was allowed to wear, is in their hands now. They are tearing it slowly, deliberately, like men who already know what they're about to do. And what happened next changed everything. You may have read the story of Joseph many times. You may know the broad strokes, the dreams, the pit, Egypt, Pharaoh, the famine, the reunion. But have you ever sat with it? Have you ever asked yourself why God allowed all of it? Why the favored son had to be hated? Why the obedient son had to be hated to be hated? Why the obedient son had to be enslaved? Why the innocent man had to be forgotten in a prison for 2 long years before anyone remembered his name? There is a reason, and by the end of the story, you will see it the way Joseph finally saw it. You will see your own pit, your own waiting, and the hand of God you did not notice was there the whole time. Joseph was 17 years old when his world ended. Genesis 37 tells us he was the favored son of Jacob, born to Rachel in his father's old age. The other brothers knew it. They saw the coat. They saw how their father looked at Joseph, the way he looked at no one else, and jealousy, slow and patient, began to grow in their hearts like a weed no one bothered to pull. Then Joseph had a dream. He dreamed that his brothers' sheaves bowed down to his. He dreamed that the sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. And perhaps unwisely, perhaps in the open honesty of a young man who had never been hated before, he told them, you can imagine the silence that followed. You can imagine the way the brothers looked at each other across the fire that night. Genesis 37 verse 4 says they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of hatred that waits. That looks for an opportunity. The opportunity came one day in Dothan. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, who were tending the flocks far from home. Joseph arrived alone in his colorful coat, and they saw him coming from a long way off. They had time to plan. By the time he reached them, they had already decided to kill him. It was Reuben, the oldest, who softened the plan. "Throw him in the pit," he said. "Do not shed his blood." He intended to come back later and rescue him. But before he could, Judah saw a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants in the distance, on their way to Egypt with spices and balm and myrrh. And Judah said, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let us sell him. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver. His own brothers. 20 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Genesis 37, verse 28. Stop there for a moment. Sit with that, because something in you knows this feeling. Maybe not exactly. Maybe you have never been thrown into a pit in the desert, but you know what it is to be betrayed by people who were supposed to love you. You know what it is to discover that the ones closest to you are not on your side. You know the silence of the pit, the way the world keeps moving above you while you sit in the dark and wonder if anyone is coming. Joseph sat in that pit, and then he walked, chained, all the way to Egypt. And nowhere in the text does it tell us he cried out against God. Nowhere does it tell us he cursed his brothers. He just walks. And then the text says something quiet but enormous. Genesis 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. That is the whole sermon right there. The Lord was with Joseph. Not the Lord rescued Joseph. Not the Lord punished his brothers. The Lord was with him. In the chains, on the road, in the slave market in Egypt, where he was sold a second time, this time to a man named Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard. And here something strange happens. Joseph rises. In a foreign land, in a foreign house with a foreign god being worshipped on every street corner, Joseph rises. Potiphar notices. He sees that whatever Joseph touches prospers. He makes him overseer of his entire household. Everything Potiphar owns passes through Joseph's hands. If you had been there, if you had been Joseph, you might have thought, this is the dream. This is what God was preparing me for. The pit was just a detour. Now the real life begins.